Today we continue on with our NHL offseason plan series. We're now on the 5th ranked team from the NHL's regular season, the Minnesota Wild. This should be a pivotal offseason for them as they start to face the cap crunch from a couple of big buyouts from last offseason. We'll discuss what we might see coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, today we're looking at the offseason plan for the Minnesota Wild, the 5th ranked team from the NHL's regular season. I think it's fair to say they had an excellent year. To some degree, I think they surprised a few people. I know I expected them to be good. I didn't know if they'd be as good as they were. They certainly exceeded expectations, I think, at least according to some. And it certainly felt like this was a year that they kind of had to go for it because they're going to be really seeing a major cap crunch kick in over the next 3 seasons. So we have some interesting stuff to discuss on what to expect from this team. Of course, if you're new to this series, what we're going to do is we're going to recap the 21-22 season, take a look at some team and individual stats, take a look at how things went. Then we're going to explore that salary cap space that they have, look at what contracts are expiring and need to be dealt with by either re-signing or replacing those players, and then what are the top questions or top priorities facing the team throughout the offseason. So let's first start by recapping the 21-22 season. It was a heck of a year, 113 points, second in the Central Division behind the Colorado Avalanche with a record of 53-22-7. They scored 305 goals, the 5th highest scoring team in the league, which is not a common thing for Minnesota. Typically, Minnesota in its history has been more defensive-minded. You don't usually see the big output like that, so that was a big step forward. Goals against was 249, so pretty much right in the middle of the league at 16th. The power play was respectable at 20.5%, at 18th best in the league, but the PK was a lot to be desired there, 76.1%. for 25th best. So certainly a high-scoring team with mediocre results between special teams and goals against. Like I said, they finished in second place. They lost in the first round of the playoffs to the St. Louis Blues with a 4-2 series victory for St. Louis in that case. Things started off good for Minnesota, but the Blues took over towards the end and kind of ran with it here. We saw lots of individual statistics that were career seasons. And this is a lot of things went right for Minnesota this year. And I really want to focus on the positives here that they had such a good year. But I do think it's possible that they do take a step back next year. And that'll be determined by what they do in this offseason, of course. But it's going to be tough to kind of match or exceed this past year because they just had, like I said, they had so many things go right. They had Kirill Kaprizov. I know he's only fairly new to the league here, but still put up more career numbers, 47 goals, 108 points. He might be able to duplicate that or maybe even exceed a bit. Yeah, he's certainly an offensive weapon, so I do see that being possible. Ryan Hartman had 34 goals. That was by far a career high. Kevin Fiala put up career high of 33 goals and 85 points. RFA needs a new contract. So that was a career high by a lot. Matt Zuccarello, at age 34, put up 79 points. A big jump from his career high as well. Marcus Foligno scored 23 goals, which was a big jump and a career high for him. So, like I said, there's just a lot of things that went well. They made some big acquisitions at the deadline. In goal with Marc-Andre Fleury, Nick Delorier to add some toughness and grit, and they also added Jacob Middleton, who also gives you some good defense and some of that toughness and grit on the back end as well. So those all worked out pretty well. I think they get good performances out of all those players, and it was really like a go-for-it year because, like I said, this is going to be a big cap crunch that the team is facing over the next 3 seasons, and it's going to be tougher for them to make additions and add at the deadline and things like that. So we'll see where it goes. Now let's explore that cap space because it's by far the biggest part of their offseason that they need to contend with here. Now, going into next year, they have 18 NHL contracts on the books for a total of $75.11 million. Now, of course, within that, though, is the dead cap space, which is linked to the Ryan Suter and Zach Parise buyouts, which totals $12.74 million in dead cap space. That's a killer. But Bill Guerin felt he needed to do it. They were well aware of the consequences when they made those decisions. I think a lot of it seemed to be around changing the culture of the team and just kind of getting a fresh start. That's kind of what Guerin thought long term. It was what was best for the organization. So that only gives them $7.388 million available to work with, which isn't really a lot when we take a look at the contracts that are coming up, which is why you hear so many trade rumors about this team. That are not going to have much of an option here, but to sacrifice a few things to create some necessary flexibility. So let's look at their expiring contracts. On the RFA side, we have Kevin Fiala. Like I said, 85-point career high. Very likely that we see him trade it, which we'll talk about in the next segment. We have Jacob Middleton and Connor Dwyer as well. Those guys are probably qualified and likely retained. Not going to cost you a ton of money, though, thankfully. On the UFA side, you got Nick Bukestad, Nick Delorier, Jordy Ben, and recently acquired Marc-Andre Fleury. Now, there has been mutual interest, according to what Fleury has said, what the Wild have said, to keep Fleury in Minnesota. But looking at those numbers, that's going to be awfully difficult to do unless he's willing to take like the Jason Spezza special and sign for league minimum, which I'm not sure. We don't have any reason to think that he would do that. Now, guys like Nick Delorier could be brought back for a fairly inexpensive deal. He'll certainly have options on the open market, though. I don't know what the future holds there. Nick Bukestad, again, he's a Minnesota guy, so it's something he probably enjoys playing at close to home, but I don't know what the future holds for him either. So now let's take a look at the top burning questions facing this team as we approach the offseason. Now, as we mentioned, the cap space by far is the storyline on the Minnesota Wild because of the dead space tied up to the buyouts. Now, of course, the big thing here too is that this year, it's not the worst of it. The next 2 years are actually worse than this year. There's going to have an extra couple $1 million in dead space in the next 2 years too. So the number goes up instead of going down. But by far, because of that, we're expecting a Kevin Fiala trade. The RFA had a career season. He's likely priced himself out of Minnesota. He had a real tough time negotiations last year. They were fairly contentious. They ended up settling on a 1-year deal, and it's expected that they just can't afford to bring him back. So certainly lots of teams have been linked to him. We've heard teams like the Islanders. We've heard teams like the Ottawa Senators, the New Jersey Devils, and there's probably others. He's a fairly dynamic offensive player. I think there'll be lots of interest. Expect probably a first-round pick and a prospect or something to that degree. Teams that are picking in the first half of the first round of the draft this year that might be willing to give up a pick. If they want to include that in something else, that might be enough to get it done. Hard to say, but I certainly expect a Kevin Fiala trade most likely to take place either right before or during the first round of the NHL Draft here coming up in Montreal in July. That would be my expectations at least, but certainly a Fiala trade is something that's very much expected. Just a matter of what the return is. Goaltending is a big question mark for this Minnesota team as well. Can they re-sign Fleury? They have Talbot for 1 more year. He's making $3.6 million. Of course, Talbot, I know was probably not happy. He didn't really get to play in the playoffs. He put up a 2.76 goals against and a .911 save percentage during the regular season, which is good, but it's not great. And I think that's why they decided to get some insurance policy, if you will, and a guy like Fleury. But he came in and he kind of took a spot. And I know that there was, I think things are okay now between the Wild and Talbot, but I think it was fair to say that there was some, not great feelings there on Talbot's side for a little bit, and I can understand why. But at the same time, I just don't think it's, mathematically possible to sign Fleury. I mean, this is still a guy who's playing really well, going to get a decent contract, and even to pay him even $3 or $4 million, look at how much that cuts into what's available in the cap. That's more than half, right? And they still have these other guys to look after. I just don't see it happening. So as much as there's mutual interest, I don't think he returns. Obviously, they have Jesper Wallstedt, who's expected to be the goalie of the future. I don't know how quickly they're going to expect him to be at the NHL level, but he's only 19, just signed his contract, coming to North America. He could certainly benefit from some time in the American Hockey League. So I think next year they go with Talbot, and they probably try to bring in somebody else by free agency or trade that's not overly expensive, another veteran on a short-term contract. Of course, they traded Kakinen as part of that Middleton trade, so he's no longer in the mix there either. So goaltending certainly a big question mark that they got to find the answer to here, and I think it's going to look a little bit different. Of course, after Talbot's contract expires next year, we could be in a completely different spot here with Minnesota Wild goaltending, of course. Could we see a Matt Dumba trade? He's another prime candidate if they want more additional cap flexibility. Of course, by not signing Fiala, that'll allow them money to sign some other players. They don't really need to trade Fiala and Dumba. I think one or the other is more likely scenario that we see, not necessarily both. But if Bill Guerin doesn't want to be right up against the cap and he wants some flexibility, then it might be something to consider. Dumba's making $6 million. He's got 1 year left on his contract, and he's a player that might not be able to afford to keep anyways, because they think, like I said, next year they already have $12 million tied up in dead space, and it goes to 14 the next 2. So it's going to be even tougher to sign players on expiring contracts beyond the current year. So as much as they like Dumba, it might prove difficult to keep him in the mix unless he's willing to sign a longer-term, shorter or lower value contract, which I don't know that he would. It might be tough to do. So it kind of depends. I mean, it might just, in my opinion, it might make sense to move him before you get to losing him for nothing. But like I said, you don't necessarily have to trade him and Fiala both. One or the other likely gets your cap space sorted out, at least temporarily. You have to ask yourself as well in Minnesota, how much can we expect from the youth to take on certain spots? Having some ELCs on the roster will certainly help. Of course, you saw what Matthew Boldy did this past year, had a real solid breakout year. Obviously, his role should continue to grow with the team, especially with Fiala likely not being there anymore. Guys like Marco Rossi, should he be able to step in? Kalen Addison on the back end, that's another reason you could consider a Dumba trade, is to give more opportunity for a guy like Kalen Addison, who's had some real solid results between his junior time and American Hockey League time. So, you get some more of these youngsters into the lineup. And obviously you hope that they can take big steps and provide you some good regular minutes to kind of offset your salary cap space. And then after that, to fill out the rest of your roster with some of these spots that are open, and there's not a ton of them, you kind of have to go bargain hunting, if you will. And it couldn't hurt for them to find a couple of veteran players that they could sign on fairly cheap contracts to kind of give some extra insulation and depth between the forward group and the blue line, depending on who else they end up trading, just because of the fact that because of the guys they got to move because of the cap, right? They're going to need somebody to play those minutes that they're not going to be there to do anymore, and somebody who can come in as a cheaper, hopefully effective role, though. And like I said, with all that in mind, they're not going to really be able to take what they did this year and think and take it up a notch. It's going to be challenging to do if you have all these guys having career seasons. It's going to be difficult for them all to kind of keep chugging at that pace. You might get one or two, and a few of them might take a step back. You take away Fiala's offense out of the mix likely, and that suddenly those 305 goals, that could drop down significantly, and it could go from being a high-ranking team to like a mediocre, maybe like a bubble team. It's difficult to say. I think there'll be impact. I think they're still going to be a good team, but we'll see what kind of magic Bill Guerin can work in this extremely tight salary cap situation to navigate through these buyouts, because it's going to be some lean times here for the Wild in the next 3 seasons. So let me know what you think the Wild are going to do this offseason and what they might look like come the fall and how they'll navigate through all this dead cap space over the next 3 years. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. We'll discuss further. If you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with the latest news, rumors, and analysis on all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.